What's up, audit fans? Dr. Amanda White here with the next video in our Standards Explained series, where I'm going to be talking about ASA700 about forming an opinion and reporting on the financial report. Now, we know that the audit opinion is the output of our entire audit process. This is the end point, and it includes everything, or it wraps up everything that we've done. So 700 is the main overarching standard in this area. The way it sort of works is that we have 700, which is sort of the overarching opinion, and it talks about unqualified, unmodified opinions. And then it branches off and it says, well, you also need to look into 705 for modifications. You need to look at 706 for emphasis of matter and other matter paragraphs. And you also need to include 701 on key audit matters. So realistically, you're going to be giving this one or one of these plus the potential for one of these, and this is going to be mandatory for everybody. If we look at our introduction and our table of contents here, you'll notice that the requirements is actually quite a lot, 40 different paragraphs. Because of the form of the opinion and the report, it's very specific about what needs to be included. And as always, there's a significant amount of other explanatory material that I don't go into. ASA and ASA700 are internationally aligned and conform, but there are additional AUS paragraphs in ASA, ASA700, or in ASA. There are additional paragraphs in ASA700 to align with our specific requirements in the Corporations Act and a few other areas, specifically audit partner names, some details about ethics, because we have some very specific ethics regulations. So let's start at the beginning of the standard and go into the scope and introduction. So our scope says, well, this is our responsibility to form an opinion on the financial report. Now, in the old days, that opinion could have been a verbal one, could have been a written one, but we now have requirements for written opinions. As I mentioned before, those other standards, ASA 701 for our key audit matters, 705 and 706 talk about modifications and emphasis of matter or other matter paragraphs. And this is specifically about general purpose financial reports. If you have special or other types of audit reports or other types of assurance reports, then ASA 800 is a specific one to look at there. So what are the objectives? And this is pretty simple. Form an opinion on the financial report, looking and evaluating the conclusions drawn from the audit evidence. So that's our whole audit process. Our whole audit process of risk assessment and developing a plan to respond to risks and gathering evidence is all to come to this conclusion, and that has to be expressed clearly in a written report. A few definitions. General purpose financial report is what we're looking at. It gives a definition of that. Our general purpose framework for us here in Australia is going to be our AASBs, and if you're international, that's going to be your country's implementation of IFRS. Now, there is a special section here. Australian accounting standards refer to those produced by the AASB. IFRS are produced by the International Accounting Standards Board. So it's pretty simple. There's not much in the way of definitions to think about. We have to form an opinion about whether management are telling the truth or not telling the truth about the financial statements. We look at materiality, and we apply the applicable financial reporting framework to our situation. Now, if you're a US student, obviously you've got GAAP and your own accounting standards, but the same general principles apply. Now, I have to obtain reasonable assurance, not a guarantee, that the report as a whole, so not just the parts that you looked at, but the entire set of financial statements, are free from material misstatements due to fraud or error. So materiality is quite important here, because we're not looking for the pieces of pencils or paper or post-it notes you've taken home, unless you've taken home a lot. It's material misstatements. Now, I have to make that conclusion considering whether we got sufficient and appropriate evidence. Are there any uncorrected misstatements that might still be in the account that might lead to the potential for a modified opinion. So I have to evaluate whether the financial report is prepared in all material respects in accordance with the applicable financial reporting framework. And remember, that's numbers as well as disclosures. Now, there are some specific things. It says the auditor shall evaluate, have we disclosed significant accounting policies? Have those accounting policies that have been applied consistent with what the accounting standard says? Are we making, or our management making, the right choices in their accounting standards? And then are they implementing them in a manner that's appropriate? Are they doing any estimates? Are they reasonable? And is the information relevant, reliable, comparable, and understandable? And you might notice that that relates back to assertions. We might have all this information. We need to make sure that it is readable by those users. We also have to make sure that the disclosures are adequate so that they can understand the effect of these important transactions on their future economic decision making. If you're in a slightly different situation and you're using a fair presentation framework, then you also need to make a statement about whether it does meet that fair presentation. We use the standard of whether it's free from material misstatement as a whole, and that actually gets covered down here in the form of the opinion. So my unmodified opinion, and remember the unmodified opinion is essentially we're giving a big tick, we're saying that management is being true and fair. The evidence tells us that the financial report in all material respects is prepared in accordance with IFRS or the AASBs. Now, what happens if you have a situation where something's not quite right? Well, there are two options. That is, there are material misstatements, or it's not free from material misstatements, or we're unable to obtain sufficient and appropriate evidence. And in that instance, then we need to skip over to ASA700. So those particular paragraphs are saying, well, if we do find something, we have to modify the opinion, and we wouldn't give the same opinion as if everything was okay and fairly presented. So the audit report section is really about the format of the audit report. This is the layout, and you'll notice that it's very specific and it's in a particular order because all audit reports look the same. So this is really formatting and style. When you look at a whole lot of audit reports next to each other, you'll notice that there aren't many differences. So some key things: has to be in writing, can't be a verbal audit report. It should have a title that's the report of an independent auditor, so that's very clear. It should be addressed to the people who are essentially the clients of the engagement. That, in most cases, is normally the shareholders. Then we give our opinion. So our opinion is right up front where we say, well, here's the client, here's what we've been auditing, and if we're saying unmodified opinion, which you might sometimes see written down as an unqualified opinion, so you might have unqualified, unmodified, or unqualified, then we're saying that, and you've got a choice of two phrases: the accompanying financial report prepares fairly in all respects with the applicable financial reporting framework, or the financial report gives a true and fair view. So there, and it says these are regarded as being equivalent. So they're the same, and what we're doing is we're giving the auditors choice in the terminology that they use. Then we need to talk about the basis for our opinion. So this is really sort of a bit about what is an audit. All right, so we give some very clear information to users who might not be aware of what we do, that we follow the auditing standards, that we talk about our responsibilities. We're not creating the accounts, it's management's responsibility. So we talk about that. With going concern, I don't actually say, yes, the company is a going concern. It's only if I think that there is an issue will I include something about going concern in an emphasis of matter paragraph. I also have to talk about my key audit matters, and my key audit matters are going to come up as part of ASA 701. And then I talk about my responsibilities. All right. So we talk about who's responsible for the financial report. That's management. We talk about management is responsible for preparing the report, applying the accounting standards. They assess the client, their own entity, to remain a going concern, and we assess the quality of their work. After sort of talking about how I follow the auditing standards, I give some very specific information about the audit. All right, and this is the auditor responsibility. So it's, what are the objectives of an audit? I'm not a guarantee. So that's very clear. Reasonable assurance, not a guarantee. I say that, well, there could be issues in the financial statements due to fraud or error, and I consider materiality, and I do everything I can to try and detect those. I also have to tell people that I use professional judgment, and I'm professionally skeptical, and I describe really a lot of the components of the audit. I talk about the risk assessment, my need to understand internal controls, knowing about accounting policies, reviewing going concern. So I have some very specific jobs to do, and all of this information is fairly pro forma and standard across different firms. I also need to tell them that I talk with those charged with governance about the audit. For listed entities, I say that I've complied with relevant ethical requirements and also relevant independence requirements under the Corporations Act and my key audit matters. You also might notice that we have the name of the engagement partner so that we know exactly which partner that is. We've had that here in Australia for a long time. That's new in the US. We have the signature of the auditor. So often they'll sign their name, so it'll be Jane Smith, and then they'll also sign for their audit firm as well. Some really basic stuff. Auditor's address, date of the auditor's report, which we know is really important for subsequent events. And of course, reports prescribed by law or regulation, especially if we're following the Corporations Act, there are some specific requirements. None of this is any different really to what we've seen in the previous sections. What if my audit was for a dual listed company? Well, here, if I do have an audit that is for a dual listed company, then I need to make sure that I have the appropriate disclosures, there's no conflict between our requirements, and that we've made all of the appropriate disclosures. Because if you're a dual listed US and Australian firm, you've got Australian auditing standards and Australian accounting standards, and then you've got US GAAP and US standards to contend with. But you should be able to comply with both in doing your audit. One last thing to look at is supplementary information. So that's information not required by the financial report, but we may need to evaluate the nature of that information and how it's presented. So if it's an integral part of the report, then I need to consider it. Quite often, it's the glossy magazine style information that's at the front of the report, and then the audit report and the financial statements will be in a very utilitarian, basic type up the back. The auditor has to consider whether the supplementary information is presented in a way that makes it look clearly different. Usually due to styling and font choices and layout, we usually clearly know where we've moved from supplementary information into the financial report. So that's all we have for ASA 700. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please pop them in the comments. Make sure you watch the videos on ASA 701, 705 and 706. If you thought the video was useful, I'd appreciate the thumbs up. If you haven't thought about subscribing, please click the subscribe button, and I will see you next time. Bye!